You're listening to Change Your POV Podcast, episode 160.
I've heard a lot of veterans that try to downplay their combat experience just because they don't want an employer to assume that they have the PTSD or something like that. And so that's a huge thing about trying to help the community, the employers in the community, understand that not all veterans have PTSD.
Change Your POV is dedicated to helping veterans be as successful out of uniform as we were when we were in. We have all heard that we should network to help find a job or change in a career. But have we given much thought to how networking can save someone's life or give them the connections needed to seek or get the help that they need? This week, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Duane France, who is a professional in the mental health counseling services industry and leverages his vast network every day to connect and add value to veterans everywhere. Duane is currently serving as the Director of Veteran Services at the Family Care Center, a private mental health counseling agency specializing in the unique needs of military service members, veterans, and their families. He is also the Executive Director of the Colorado Veterans Health and Wellness Agency, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Duane is a retired Army NCO and has deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, North Africa, and Bosnia. Duane continues to serve veterans and their families as a full-time clinical mental health counselor and is always looking for ways to engage, provide value, and add to his growing network. Let's check out this fantastic interview. All right, folks, welcome to Change Your POV Podcast. I am your host, Eddie Lazary, and I am here with Duane France. Now, I've read his bio at the top of the show, and Duane reached out to me. I don't know, maybe I reached out to him. It was mutual, I think. We kind of ran into each other right around the same time. I think it was LinkedIn that we actually connected. And he's doing some amazing things with veterans with regard to mental health. And Bennett, unfortunately, could not make this call. He was very anxious or very excited to come on here and talk to Duane because this is something, as we all know, Bennett is extremely passionate about. He himself is a licensed peer support. Let me say that again. He is a licensed peer support specialist for the VA, and he really, really enjoys this field. I too enjoy it, but I don't obviously have the same background and experience that Bennett and Duane does. So I'm going to do my best, Duane, to facilitate an intelligent conversation around mental health. How's that sound?
Oh, that sounds great. As a matter of fact, a lot of your conversations touch on this subject, and you guys do speak intelligently on it pretty often. So I think we're okay.
All right, very good. So before we get too far, I would like the listeners to hear from you, Duane, about, where you're from, a little bit about your military experience and how you ended up in the field you're in.
Okay, yeah. So my family and I currently live in Colorado Springs, or actually just south of Colorado Springs, Colorado. I was stationed here at Carson in 2006 and retired from Carson in 2014. And Carson is one of those locations that when you get there, you never want to leave. So yeah, we retired here. I did the bulk of my deployments here. I'd like to say that the family's been here at Carson since 2006, but I definitely was not. So I had one of the 15-month surge tours in 2006, 2007 in Baghdad. Then went to Afghanistan about a year later for a deployment in RC East. That was 2009, 2010. Then did another short tour with the MIT team in Kabul in 11 to 12. Finished out my career in 10th Group in their support unit there, and did a short tour to North Africa. So my military career, I spent 22 years in. I was in logistics because I wanted the first thing smoking that gave me a little bit of money. And back in the mid-'90s, a little bit of bonus money was about $2,000, which was spent pretty quick and nowhere near worth the effort that went into it. But yeah, I've been stationed in Germany twice, the 82nd back in the late 90s. Unfortunately, when I volunteered for combat to go during the invasion, the Army sent me to another type of combat. So I was on recruiting for 3 years right there at the beginning of the war.
Oh, wow. So what was that? So recruiting right at the beginning of the war must have been rather interesting, to say the least, yeah?
It was. I mean, it was actually, for me, it was a matter of, I'd spent 10 years waiting to train to go to the Super Bowl, and I ended up in the front office doing sales. So it was, at that time, there wasn't a lot of us, there weren't a lot of combat vets. Luckily for me, I had an opportunity to recruit outside of Fort Meade, Maryland. So it was recruiting outside of military installation was a lot easier, a lot more familiar. I couldn't BS anybody because they just go ask their uncle, or their mom or their dad, what was the real deal about the Army. So I had a really good stint, and it was beneficial for me later on as a leader. In my leadership development, number one was learning how to connect with people in the community, gaining referrals and hey, this guy's a straight shooter. You should talk to him about joining the Army. But then when I come a platoon sergeant and a first sergeant later in my, when I came here to Carson, I had some understanding of the younger soldiers at that time because I had just put them in the Army. So I think it was, as much as I like to say that it was, grumble about recruiting, it was actually a pretty good leadership development opportunity for later in my career.
Yeah, totally agree. I was never a recruiter. My gunner, I was in Iraq from 04 to 05 in Baghdad as well, and my gunner ended up eventually going recruiting. And I remember when he first came down with orders, he was like, "Oh, that's it. I'm hanging it up. I'm getting out of the military. This is definitely not what I want to do. I definitely don't want to do recruiting." And myself and I think my platoon sergeant at the time, we kind of talked with him and said, it's only a few years. Just, go do your time. You might learn something, and you never know. You might even like it. And he's like, yeah, doubtful, but okay, whatever. So he re-enlisted. He went and did his initial, tour, whatever it is, 2 or 3 years. I don't even know now. And before his time was up, he's like, not only do I like it, but I'm actually really good at it. And so he ended up re-enlisting again, and he ended up going permanent recruiter, whatever that's called.
Right.
And that's what he's still doing today.
Yeah, it's and so that's an opportunity, and that's one of the big things that especially active duty, everybody's I hate recruiting, but it's really sort of a forced choice because everybody who really loved recruiting and enjoyed it stayed out there and converted to be a recruiter, changed their MOS. And so by default, everybody else who hated recruiting or really didn't like recruiting kind of went back and badmouthed recruiting,
right?
Back to the mainstream. That was actually, I had some very good mentors as far as, people. A lot of it is about sales, but it's also about, kind of believing in the product. And of course, I loved the Army. I believed in the Army. And they say that you recruit your own. So I put in a lot of grunts. I put in a lot of military intelligence, but mainly my focus was finding guys that were living in dad's basement that really weren't doing much of anything. And that's where I was when I joined the Army. And I was like, look, life can't get much worse and it could probably get better. So how about you join? So in that actually, starting there, it was very interesting. I had our first sergeant really focused on essentially psychology. What motivates people, what makes people want to do something. And there was a lot of leadership. I first got turned on to like John C. Maxwell and of course Zig Ziglar, in listening to them around that time. And it was more about leadership than it was about, kind of hustling or tricking somebody. And that's really where I first started getting interested in psychology as a field and what makes, at that point, soldiers or potential soldiers want to do the things they do. So, and you asked earlier about what got me into the mental health field. I can really point back to my time in recruiting, that I really found that kind of thing interesting.
Mm-hmm. So was it something that you've always been interested in? Like you just maybe studied it a little bit in high school and thought that might be something you'd be interested in? Like, how did you fall into the interest of psychology and mental health?
And that's something that it's not what I had always kind of really wanted to do. I took a shot at college early on. My first year, I tried the reserves, and I tanked one semester of school and said that was it. Then when I was at Bragg at the 82nd, I took a semester, and I really didn't do much there either, except the only class that was interesting was an intro to psych for me. So that coupled with recruiting, but really I kind of always imagined myself as a high school teacher, as one of those cool English teachers or history teachers. I had one in high school. He was a Vietnam vet, and we could derail him by asking him war stories, and we wouldn't get any homework, right?
Right, yeah.
That's what I imagined, that I would kind of be that guy. And so I was already in E7 by the time I got to Iraq in 06. And one of my guys, E5, he'd come in and he kind of showed me his diploma. He was like, "Oh, look, I just got an associate's degree." And he's like, "What's your degree in, Sergeant?" And I said, "Well, my degree's in none of your business."
Right.
By that time, you're focused on career, and so I had never really looked at it. I guess then I was at probably 13 or 14 years in, already in E7. So, and then he was like, "Oh, come on, you could, it's pretty easy." So I went and looked online, and and especially back then with all the connections, even with all the comma blackouts and stuff, you could still do a lot of online schooling with your downtime, rather than playing Call of Duty or whatever we were doing back then.
Mm-hmm.
So I reached out to the Ed Center and told them, I want to look at a degree and not sure really what I want to do. I did say I wanted the thing that had the least amount of math possible. So, zero math, if at all. So they found me a program, counseling and applied psychology. Even then, I didn't see myself as a mental health professional. It was all just like, okay, cool, whatever. So I started my associate's degree, and that was in 07. And then when we got back from that tour, we were sitting in one of those big reintegration briefings, and a counselor from our local vet center was talking to the assembled company there, and this wasn't part of her normal brief or whatever, but she said, at the end of it, "Oh, by the way, if any of you are interested in psychology or mental health, really consider being a mental health counselor, because there are not enough combat veterans in the mental health counseling field."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Oh, well, really? Well, it's just one of those light bulb moments." She herself was a retired Air Force major, I think. And it was really just one of those kind of serendipitous moments that everything kind of converged at one time. And I started looking into it, and she was absolutely right. There's not a lot of, in the mental health counseling field, there's not a lot of veterans themselves, minus combat veterans or what have you. So I just kind of started working from there. Kind of another thing that happened around the same time is there was an article in the local paper here in Colorado Springs about a veterans court starting up. And the veterans courts are programs in various jurisdictions that will, instead of a veteran going to jail or being put on standard probation, they're put in a separate program where they're actually given mental health counseling, treatment plans, and they have access to a lot more kind of restorative programs. And I remember reading that about the same time, and I was like, you know what? Those guys are going to be the guys that need somebody they can talk to, mm-hmm. somebody that gets what they did and understands, what they went through. And so those two things right there really kind of started me on the path. And then doing some more research and had a couple of other mentors along the way who just steered me, make sure you get this program versus that program. And it all kind of worked out. And here I am working as a counselor, ironically, in the actual court. That's one of my primary duties is I'm the non-VA counselor for our local veterans court. But I also have a grant program, and I do some different things that we can maybe get into later.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned this, right? This vacuum that is, counseling. Let's just call them counselors that are also, former military and even and have combat experience. Because a lot of veterans that I talk with, they know they need to seek counseling, and they go, and they end up speaking with somebody that they feel, now let's be honest, a lot of guys don't even give these highly qualified counselors even a chance, right? They go into the first meeting and they've already shut themselves down from the potential of receiving help because they're under this auspice of, oh, you've never been there, you've never served, you don't get it. You know what I mean?
Sure. No, absolutely. And that's one of the challenges is for someone that's reticent to seek mental health counseling in the first place, any reason is a great reason not to go. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of veterans will say, well, I can only talk to someone who's been there. Well, that's not exactly true. And as I don't know that I've ever really believed that in the first place. But as I've gone through, and I have some outstanding colleagues, both at my agency and those that work at our local VA, that never deployed, but absolutely do understand the military mindset and military culture. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if a veteran's saying, well, I'm only going to go to somebody who's a veteran, you're already, limiting yourself from who you can see.
Right.
The challenge is when veterans go to counselors and other counselors and therapists don't take the time to understand about the military. They don't take the time to research or things like that. That's when, if the veteran kind of goes up against say a counselor that they don't click with, that doesn't get them, they'll just stop going.
Right, absolutely. So I love this idea, and I've heard about this before. I'm not sure from whom. This veteran court thing, right? And it's not everywhere. I think it should be, but it's definitely not everywhere. But I think it's really awesome that it's in your area, and I really enjoy the idea that you've done something with it and are participating in the outcome, in the successful outcome of that program. So let me ask you this, without divulging any names, obviously. What are some common things that you see veterans coming through the veteran court system for? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of different things, a lot of crazy stuff, but I'm sure there's a lot of commonality across the board too, would you say?
No, there is, absolutely. And I kind of break it down into 4 different situations. I mean, and a lot of it's, Joe goes downtown and, breaks windows out and things like that. But and usually they'll find themselves, face to face to a cop or sit in the back of a police cruiser. And now I'm all of a sudden in front of a judge. And so these are not veterans who are hardened criminals. They never intended to commit a crime or anything else. So they didn't mean to find themselves in trouble. They didn't mean to be standing in front of a judge and having to explain themselves. But we typically see about 4 different things. One, of course, is alcohol-related. So alcohol-related incidents, DUIs, and things like that. So that is a big one. Another one that I kind of call the take this plane to Cuba type of crime is, maybe they have a firearm and they wave it around in the air, or they wave it at somebody. It's an unfortunately pretty common thing. Veterans, we do enjoy our weapons, and sometimes weapons and alcohol, of course, don't mix. So that's another challenge. Another thing that we often see is relational challenges, domestic disputes, domestic violence, situational domestic violence. Rarely, if ever, is it really kind of a domestic battery, the severe, not that any kind of domestic violence is really bad. And then other types of, like bar fights, harassment kind of things, if veterans downtown and they get into, so that'll end up as being some type of assault. So those are typically the 4 major things that the veteran will experience to be able to get them into a type of veteran court.
Mm-hmm. Well, with regard to the psychology piece, the mental health piece, what's some stigma surrounding seeking help that veterans struggle with that you can kind of help clear up to maybe encourage them to seek help? Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have before listening to this show.
Well, yeah, well, it goes back to our military service, right? You don't want to be that the guy that goes to sick call.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to be the gal that that's always sitting sitting at the clinic or something. It's that's the idea of you want to be the one that sucks it up, that drives on, that is dependable. And so there's really an internal stigma along, and it starts in active duty military of, I'm strong, I've got this, I'm not, I can handle, what's going on. There's really both an internal stigma and an external stigma kind of in the environment. The external stigma, even as I saw it when I left in 2014, and it's starting to change now, a lot of the senior leaders are coming out and saying, look, I wouldn't still be married if I didn't get marriage counseling. I've got these issues. I mean, you can't go through this sustained, the sustained combat, the period of time that we did without, having some things you need to work on. It doesn't mean that you're crazy. It doesn't mean that you're sick. It doesn't mean an illness, but, you can't just keep running an oil without, or running a car without getting a tune-up. Mm-hmm. So the external stigma is starting to shift somewhat at the kind of command level. But I really kind of equate it to, when we would come back from deployments and you'd go through your readiness processing, your post-deployment processing. So you go through and you get poked and prodded and checked, and then you have to wait in line to see a provider for 15 minutes, and that provider wants to make sure, nothing's going on, you don't drink too much, or you're sleeping all right. But you've actually been sitting in that line for an hour and a half next to your squad leader, mm-hmm. and next to your buddy who was with you the whole time, and they're the ones saying, "Oh, don't say nothing, because if you say something, you're not going to be able to take leave, or you're not going to be able to, you're going to be stuck here for longer." And so everybody's, hey, just don't say anything, and you'll be fine. Which, while maybe good advice, kind of in the moment, but it's definitely not good for the long term. So there is that stigma against reaching out and seeking help, or people will think there's something wrong with me if I actually go to a mental health provider.
Right. And that happens when they're in the military, but it also happens when they get out. These guys are now veterans, and they're struggling with the same things they were when they were in. But now they don't work for the military. They work for an employer, and there's a lot of the same kind of thought process around seeking help. A lot of people are nervous about seeking help because it brings into question their ability to perform their job, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I've heard a lot of veterans that try to downplay their combat experience just because they don't want an employer to assume that they have the PTSD or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so that's a huge thing about trying to help the community, the employers in the community, understand that not all veterans have PTSD. Just because you deployed doesn't mean you immediately develop post-traumatic stress, or it doesn't mean, everybody knows about PTSD and TBI now. And most of what I see veterans struggling with go beyond just PTSD and TBI, but that's really what a lot of the employers think of, mm-hmm. That, oh, you're a combat vet. And of course, hiring practices, I can't ask you if you've ever killed anyone, or I can't ask you what your disability is. So in the absence of that, maybe the employer just assumes that that's the case. Right. And then they start to, act a little strange. And, when you act a little strange around a vet, you might get somebody staring at you sideways. So it's just this compounding thing that veteran, or that employers or family members or the community is kind of afraid to ask, and the veteran doesn't really want to tell. And so everybody just agrees not to talk about it when it's still right there and very relevant to the situation.
It's like Clinton's don't ask, don't tell policy, right? It's very similar. So not that long ago, Bennett and I had a very, very, I would say, a candid discussion on one of our shows where we discussed this idea of moral injury. And I know that was one of the shows that you actually listened to before coming on here. And it's something that we believe a lot of veterans, and not just veterans, but even active, currently serving military, people struggle with this idea of moral injury versus PTSD. but they're unfamiliar with moral injury and what it means. So in order to put a label to what they're feeling or experiencing, then they just throw out the term PTSD because they don't know what else to call it. What can you tell us about this idea of moral injury?
Yeah, so that was a really great conversation that you guys had, and you guys had, you really boiled it down and hit the nail on the head. The guilt and the shame that a veteran feels, that's not explained by PTSD.
Right.
And so, boiling it down to its very, very basic, and some of my colleagues will probably be up in arms, but PTSD is sort of like an automatic Pavlovian response. Trauma occurs, and then I learn, or my brain has a certain reaction to that. And then when a stimulus that reminds me of that comes back, I react again in the same way. Mm-hmm. And so it's a stimulus response kind of thing. And so I like to say PTSD is really an injury of the behavior. My behavior has changed. And in some very real cases, my brain structure neurologically has changed by repeated exposure to trauma. But I behave differently, and my thoughts and emotions even can be affected. TBI, traumatic brain injury, of course, is a physical injury of the brain, but moral injury can be considered an injury of the soul, an injury of the spirit, in which my core beliefs about what is right and wrong in this world have been changed. Mm-hmm. Meaning, and you guys mentioned a lot of the extreme circumstances, committing, just the act of killing, number one, but seeing things happen that I couldn't stop. But there's also lower level moral injuries. Like there's no such thing as stoplights in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. I didn't have any, right? No stop signs. One-way street was whichever way that I was driving. There were no such thing as traffic circles. We were, soldiers, Marines, airmen, whoever was on the ground. We drove through and made sure that we were protected and safe. And I hesitate to say do what we wanted, but in some senses it really was very much if I wanted somebody to stop, I would show the proper force, and sometimes that meant pointing a gun in their face. Mm-hmm. And so someone who hadn't been exposed to that kind of behavior before now finds that behavior is gratifying. That behavior gets results that I want, and now I have to come back to the States and stop at stop signs and go the right way and obey speed limits and sit behind the nice old lady in the checkout line, which is writing her little check and everything. And so these are just some like almost small changes that occur in a veteran's core belief about what's right and wrong with the world. Mm-hmm. And so it really is a stretch of that's what moral injury is. It's changing what we think is okay to do and be.
Yeah, and so here's a quick story of an experience that I had when I was in Baghdad, 04-05. There was a VBID, a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, or commonly known as car bomb, that went off. Probably 800 meters north of our FOB, and the explosion was absolutely horrific. It broke windows. It shook shit off the walls. It was massive. And we knew as soon as it went off, it was bigger than, we've had mortar rounds come into the FOB. We've heard distant IEDs go off, so we were very, very acute to the different types of attacks and munitions and whatever the enemy was using. So when this thing went off, we're like, oh my God, this was definitely, not mortar, not an IED. This was something bigger. And I didn't know what it was or where it was. I just knew we had a spin up. We were the brigade QRF at the time, so we knew anything that was going on in our sector. Our recon troop were the ones that were basically spun up, and we went out. And so we got our gear on, we got the trucks lined up, we got our mission. We found out it was an explosion north of our FOB, and it was right around the time of the elections, and it was the first free elections that Iraq has had in over 30 years at this point, and it was the interim elections. And I don't know if you remember during that period of time, there was a lot of assassinations on candidates, people that were running for office at different political levels. They were getting executed all different ways and in shapes and sizes. And this particular car bomb was an actual suicide attempt of someone that was running for an elected position. And the car bomb went off, and I don't know if it killed him, but I know it got some of his guys, his entourage, and a whole lot of civilians. It was big enough where it blew cars literally up out of the street, up onto the roofs of the nearby houses. It left a huge crater in the asphalt road, and we found the engine block, I don't know, probably a quarter mile down the road. It was absolutely horrific. And and of course, by the time we got there, the crowds had started to come, and a lot of people on foot, a lot of vehicles started to pull up, and we were just like, this could get ugly quick. We didn't know exactly what it was, why it happened at the time, and we had to set up kind of a snap checkpoint, or a kind of a perimeter, if you will, security perimeter, while we try to assess the situation. And we got our vehicles kind of cordoned off into this loose security position, and me and my platoon sergeant walked in, and we were very cautious, and we started to walk towards all the commotion, and I started to feel like it was almost like walking on hamburger, kind of like that feeling underneath your feet. And I looked down, and I was like, at first I was like, what the hell is that? These little tiny little pieces of look like, hamburger. And it dawned on me that it was human flesh I was walking on, right? And the closer, the further we got into the crowd, and the closer we got to the point of origin, the larger the chunks became. And so we kind of we realized what happened, and we were trying to figure out, was there any military or coalition involvement, or is any, soldiers out there that were hurt or injured or whatever. We didn't know. And then all of a sudden, I pulled my truck. We got our trucks up a little bit closer because we were a little too far away from them. We got our trucks up a little bit closer, and I started to notice these little kids. We're talking like 6, 7 years old. They were running around like everybody else was in like chaos, right? And people were crying and screaming, and these kids were running around, and it looked like they were playing a game, and it caught my attention because it was out of the ordinary. And I started to watch these kids, and I started to think, I'm trying to figure out what they're doing. Like, what kind of game is it that they're playing? And I noticed that they each of these kids, there must have been 6 or 7 of these kids now. Each of these kids are basically running around with 2 pieces of cardboard, like a little scooper and a little like a plate almost, to kind of bring it into some mental image for you. And what they were doing is they were running around. They were scooping up bits and pieces of human flesh, and they were running over, and they were each creating their own pile. And I think the game, without being able to understand their language, I think the challenge of the game was to collect the largest pile of human flesh, and whoever had the largest pile of human flesh won, right? And so that's what these kids were doing. They're running around picking up these chunks, these different body parts and things like that. And this one kid picked up this pretty sizable piece of something, and he runs over to me, Mister, look, Mister. And I looked down, and it was like the side. It was skin. It was like it was a section of someone's face that included the nose and like the eye socket and part of the cheek. But there was no skull attached to it. It was all just skin. It was almost like you had taken flesh. Yeah, it was almost like you had taken like a Halloween mask and kind of cut it, and you cut out the nose and the eye and a part of the cheek, but it was a human piece of flesh. And I remember like pointing over to the pile that had the least amount in it, and kind of I was chuckling like go over there and help that kid out because he doesn't have very much compared to all these other kids. And I know the story that I'm telling is extremely, like, people at home are probably like, what in the hell's what? So I get back to my fob when it was all done, and I sit down in my bed, and I think back on that day, and I think back on that story and what happened. And I remember thinking to myself, I was actually getting into this game with these kids. Like, I was laughing, I was chuckling. Like, we're talking like human beings that died literally 10, 15 minutes before. I didn't know if that was a woman that just, that that had 6 kids at home. That I had no idea who these people were, but I just remember feeling this wave of guilt come over me. Like, how could I have engaged in that? How could I have laughed at that or gotten into the fun or the thrill of that game? And that's the kind of moral injury. Like, you come home to the United States and, yeah, I mean, I'm 15 years separated from the war now, but I live those feelings, and I live those thoughts, and I recall those memories every single day. And sometimes what we're talking about with moral injury here is, how could I have allowed myself, like, is that really the person that I really am? It's those questions that we internalize. We question our own humanity, our own morals, our own beliefs, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's exactly what you're talking about, is the fact that, you would look at someone else, say, oh my God, how could they have done such a thing? But hearing that experience, it doesn't surprise me at all. It goes back to, I think it was in 2011 when it was pretty big, and you saw the videos of the Marines, urinating on the deceased enemy, and then they videotaped and put it on the internet. And no veteran I have ever talked to has said, they condone that, they think it's horrible. And yet everyone says, but I understand how they got to the place where they thought that was okay at that point, while not condoning that. That's a perfect example of moral injury. And even for the audience, in another example would be if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, right? And they come in where all the gliders are down, and they're starting to play in poker with the dog tags, right? And they're sitting there making the games and throwing the pile and everything else. And then finally the medic comes in, and he's like, these are their buddies. But they were like, holy crap. They didn't even think about that, because their concept of what is right and wrong, good and bad, was changed a little bit. And you hear the stories about veterans when they first go into combat, soldiers or, servicemen, they first go into combat. And maybe it takes them a month to realize that, hey, this is really real. On their second deployment, it may take 2 weeks. On the third or fourth deployment, they're in there right away. So at the very beginning, they're duck in and dive in and being safe. But halfway through the deployment, they're walking around like that dude in Apocalypse Now. I love the smell of napalm.
Right, yeah.
Those are the kind of things that, that those are the changes that happen. And once those changes happen there, and then it doesn't, and there's not a lot of awareness coming back. A lot of, and there's a couple of really good resources for moral injury. One of them is Jonathan Shea's book, Achilles in Vietnam. And Jonathan Shea, he's talking about Vietnam veterans and correlating it to Achilles and Agamemnon and the Trojan War, and showing how the correlation between exposure to battle, but what Jonathan Shea and then later on Brett Litz and Shira Magwin and some of them, what they all talk about, it's about betrayal. And in your experience, it's a betrayal of what you think is right. You betrayed yourself. You betrayed your own sense of morality. And so what moral injury tends to be is a betrayal of what I think should be right and wrong. And so there's betrayal of our friends. We see somebody do something that we think shouldn't have been done, or we betray our own morality or sensibilities, or we're even betrayed by our command. I'm being sent out on this route, and I know it's IEDs. They know it's IEDs, and you're sending me out there anyway. And that's that kind of sense of betrayal that's different from PTSD and TBI.
Right.
It's not, as you guys identified, it's not a diagnosable mental health condition. It's not in the DSM, but it is a very real aspect of what veterans experience. Survivor's guilt is more moral injury than it is PTSD.
Right. Absolutely. And I actually wrote an article about this as well, and it's titled, have you ever met What If? It's this game that I played with myself when I first got back from deployment. I would have these what if wars with myself. What if we had left the FOB a little bit earlier? What if I had paid attention or looked to my right instead of looking to my left? What if, all of these things that we can what if shit to death, right? And I used to really, really get hung up, because I was a senior squad leader and I was responsible for the lives of 9 men every time we rolled outside the FOB. And not all of us came back in one piece. And I live with that every single day. And I what if myself to death. And so that article, if you've never read it, for you, Duane, as well as the listening audience, it's on the Change Your POV under blog, and it's titled, Have You Ever Met What If? And it's just it's a little bit of a parody into that idea, and it really touches on this whole idea of moral injury. And I think it's important that we not only begin that dialogue, but we share that dialogue of moral injury, because it's one that I don't think gets enough attention. And a lot of people, when they claim to be suffering from PTSD, when in reality, because let's face it, there's a lot of people that suffer from quote unquote PTSD, but they've never actually experienced combat in the sense of, shooting rounds at an enemy or an enemy shooting rounds at them, and the combat exchange isn't there, but yet they still experience this idea of PTSD, when in reality, I think more than that, I think it's moral injury that a lot of people seem to suffer from versus PTSD. But I could be wrong. I'm not a professional in this field. It's just something, this idea that Bennett actually brought up to me, this whole notion of moral injury, and we were doing some research on it, and it's just amazing because when I read through the effects of moral injury and what it is and how it can fester and can come to be in one's life, I relate more of the issues that I still have 15 years later to symptoms around moral injury than I do of PTSD. I do suffer a little bit from what we call them triggers, and that's the next thing I want to talk about with you really quick, and that's this idea of triggers when it comes to PTSD or any other thing. When we come back from the military, even when we're still in the military, we have these things that trigger us. And what I've found, and I've never actually sat down across the table from any professional, so to speak, but things that I just kind of figured out on my own is, like, when I first got back, I really, really struggled with being in a room with a lot of people, whether it be a restaurant or Walmart on Black Friday or whatever the case may be. Like, if there was a lot of people around, like, I felt claustrophobic. I got anxiety. My heart started to race. And so but
if you were in a closed space, right?
Yeah.
Not if you were out in an open space in crowds, maybe that wasn't bad for you, but in a closed space.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I found, I'd find myself kind of skirting the walls or, sitting again in the corner or, make sure I was aware of where exits were, things like that. And you hear that a lot. But one of the things that I started to do is I started to intentionally put myself in uncomfortable positions a little bit at a time. Instead of avoiding them or hiding them, I would push myself. I would engage in that uncomfort feeling. And then a little over time, a little bit, I became less and less anxious, and it became more and more normal for me to feel comfortable in those positions. Now, right. I haven't gotten away from 100%, but that's something that I do to kind of help combat those triggers as I face them head on and I actually tickle them a little bit. What's your experience there?
Well, and that's the thing is it starts to, with awareness, that you're aware that this is a difference that you had been, experiencing before, so crowded rooms, parties never used to be a problem. Now it is. You were aware of it. Then you decided, maybe I don't understand why it is, but I don't want this to continue. So you did something intuitively to kind of make the change. I can absolutely relate. My while as bad as our first deployment, in the 15-month in Baghdad was, my more significant deployment was in Afghanistan. And we lost people, and not everybody came back. But for us, and we were security escort for, long story, but a really long way. So it was probably a 2 or 3 day mission securing routes. And once we got to a certain point in the route, we always went at night, just for the cover and for safety. And after a certain point, we got tired of getting blown up during the day. So we switched to night, and full illume was always the dangerous time. You used to argue with the S2, don't send us out in full illume, because every time we would go out in full illume, we'd get hit. Not that we wouldn't be able to handle it, but it was just like, okay, brace up, boys, because that we're gonna do this. The other piece of this was cornfields. They would use the cover of the cornfields to get up right on top of the convoy. So I really don't enjoy driving through Kansas on a full moon. That's just one of my big things. But I came back from that deployment. And by that time, I took over a company. And so I was the first sergeant of the company. I go to let my dogs out in the morning. And the first time the full moon here in Colorado, it's huge and bright. And I just froze in the doorway. And this thought came in that said, they're going to see me. And then after that, I was like, wait a minute, who's going to see me? Freaking neighbors in my boxer shorts? Who gives a crap? Right? and I started, but even now, as you say, I kind of keep a kind of a warning eye. I know when the full moon is coming out, but it doesn't bother me as much because I recognized what it was. I really recognized why it, what it tied to specifically was related to our night missions in Afghanistan. And then I was able to tell myself, you know what, I'm in Colorado. Nobody's going to shoot me. I was able to talk myself down and calm myself down. Without that awareness, that's where it starts to get to be a problem. If the veteran is not familiar with, themselves enough or aware enough to say, okay, I know that I'm noticing these things, this has changed, and then having the desire to actually make a difference, then that's where it can get kind of more long term.
So, man, we're run out of time, but I do want to ask you one more brief question, and it's a brief question, but it's actually the whole crux of this month, and that's networking. But I think everything we've talked about up to this point really wraps around to networking, and at its core, to be honest with you, networking is nothing more than having other people within your sphere that you can call upon to either help them out or for them to help you out. And I honestly think that the conversation that we've had so far about mental health, about moral injury, about PTSD, TBI, seeking help where there's help to be had, and really it's about understanding that it is so damn hard to do this alone, right?
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, and this is what I always tell people, if you're looking for a mechanic, you go to somebody and say, hey, I know a guy, right? If you're looking for a realtor, you want to buy the house, hey, I know a guy. I know a gal who can help you with that. But somehow with this idea around mental health, that there's not this, I know a guy, we don't even reach out and make those connections, which is really, why with my blog and with the activity, even on LinkedIn, as you've mentioned that we connected on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a professional networking platform, but I know that there are tons of veterans on there because the TAP classes are putting it out and things like that. And so I started writing on LinkedIn and talking on LinkedIn to start breaking down that stigma around veteran mental health, and being able to help people understand, hey, this is something that you can talk about. But yeah, absolutely, networking is huge. It was huge for me when I was finding mentors, because that's what leadership was in the military. It was mentorship. It wasn't just bosses telling you what to do.
Right.
And so as I was preparing to transition from what I was doing in the military in logistics to something totally different, I had to go out and seek out mentors, and I did that through networking. Even before what I'm doing now, I started out volunteering, strategic volunteering, kind of in the community, which led to my first position as a program director for a nonprofit that provided housing for homeless veterans. That job that wasn't widely advertised. I just happened to be in a meeting where somebody said, oh, by the way, this person left. We have an opening. Who wants to apply? Well, sure. Why not? And so that's what, everybody's like, oh, it's because it's all about who you know. It really is all about who you know. And the more people that you know and the more value you bring to the people in your network, the better that it's going to be for you. The key that I found with networking is help others before you expect to be helped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then once that happens,
there's definitely an element that a lot of people seem to miss, and that is providing value first. And a lot of people think that, oh, well, if I have 10,000, friends on LinkedIn, and I got 2,000 friends on Facebook, and I've got 10,000 friends on Twitter, it doesn't matter how many people, liked you or friended you or whatever the case may be, depending on what platform you were on. If you can't reach out to that extensive network that you've created to be able to exchange ideas and thoughts and pass around, like you said, you've got to be able to provide value first for that network to be of any use to you down the road. And it's really the difference between having a network that is a mile wide and an inch deep versus a network that's a mile deep and an inch wide, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a matter of, if you want to make a difference, and this is a huge thing for me, and this is what you are doing and what Bennett is doing, is we in this generation have an amazing opportunity to make an impact if we let our voices be heard. Mm-hmm. We're the largest cohort of veterans since World War II. Now, they were probably 4 times as big as us, but we have obviously the platform of technology. We have the skills, we have the ability. We can only lift up other veterans by telling our own stories and giving opportunities for other veterans. You're doing it through podcasting and blogging. I'm primarily doing it with blogging outside of my area as well as inside Colorado Springs here. But it's giving a voice to veterans that may not have had that voice before. Mm-hmm. And that's how you get your message out and achieve your goal. You're passionate about what you're doing. Obviously, Bennett is passionate about what he's doing. And our passion is what will help us make changes in our immediate area. I never said I was going to change the Army, but I'm definitely going to try to change or take care of my corner of it.
Absolutely.
And that's all we can do.
That's right. Yeah, and if everybody did that, right, if everyone just did their job, like take the Super Bowl this weekend. Well, we're recording this in February. This show's not coming out till middle of March, but so we just watched.
Well, they'll still be talking about it then.
Yeah. And it really comes down to Belichick looking at his guys in the locker room. I can only imagine his words, and that was probably, hey, listen, just do your job. Whatever your job is, whether it's a linebacker, a running back, defensive end, it doesn't matter. Whatever your job is on that football field, just focus on doing the best job you can at your job. Don't worry about everything else. Don't worry about everyone else. Do your job. And I think that message, we can extend that out to the veteran community. If everyone just took care of their message, if they took care of their corner of the world, then by the time everyone pulls together, you have this massive spiderweb effect where the network is not only a mile wide, but it's also a mile deep, and that's kind of the ultimate goal, I think. And the veteran community, like you said, it's a large community, but at the same time, it's actually a very small community too. And it doesn't take very long before you're able to connect one veteran to another, or to find help for one veteran for another. And that's what's really cool about the veteran community. I have been unable to find anything that compares to it outside of the military a veteran community. And so for that, I'm glad I am an honored member for life. So that does it, Duane. Where can people find more about you and they want to connect?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned, I am a practicing clinical mental health counselor. Our agency, if you're here in Colorado Springs, it's called the Family Care Center. So you can see us there at fccsprings.org, www.fccsprings.com. But I also write for a wider audience of veterans, their spouses, and their community on my blog, which is veteranmentalhealth.com. So either one of those two locations, you can find me and connect with me. I'm more than willing to have a conversation about veteran mental health. And if you're looking for assistance, as you mentioned, Eddie, there's networks all over the place, and we can connect you with somebody. Because my takeaway from the Super Bowl is just don't quit. Mm-hmm. Just don't quit. No matter how bad it actually seems, don't quit. And in a lot of veterans, unfortunately, sometimes think that they're on the field by themselves, and they look up at the scoreboard and they do decide to quit. And they're not aware of the team that they have around them. So, yeah.
Well, there you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. You can find all of the show notes for everything we talked about by heading over to the show notes page for this episode at changeyourpov.com/episode 160. Never miss an episode. Hit subscribe on your podcast player of choice. We have a lot more great content headed your way. And folks, we've got something very brand new. We haven't even done the hard launch for it yet, but I'm going to introduce it tonight. And that is our Patreon page. Folks, you have a way now to give back to this show and to help veterans. Help us help veterans. And you can find more by heading over to changeyourpov.com/support us. Until next time.